Trotsky and the Neoconservatives. Introduction, a question that needs real answers. Leon Trotsky was a lifelong Marxist intellectual. He was the leader of the Red Army during the Russian Civil War and a founder of the Soviet government. Even after being exiled from the USSR, he continued spending his life building Marxist organizations and speaking for what he considered to be the genuine principles of Bolshevism. Yet, from among his intellectual disciples and members of his Fourth International emerged some of the key strategists of the Republican Party and U.S. foreign policy in the final years of the Cold War. This irony has long been a source of discussion. During the Bush administration, talk of the neocons popped up with documentaries like The Power of Nightmares, The Rise of Politics of Fear on BBC in 2004. Libertarians and old rightists who opposed the Bush administration's war and violations of civil liberties developed a narrative to explain it, a narrative that was embraced by Alex Jones at the time when he was much more obscure. The narrative was that communism is an ideology that seeks to destroy freedom, and the neoconservatives, like the communists, share this desire to enslave mankind. The narrative went on to argue that the Bush doctrine of, quote, spreading freedom was permanent revolution, as Trotsky had written of, intended to usher in global communist dictatorship. This narrative is wrong on a number of counts and fails to take into account that Trotsky turned against the Soviet Union and was convicted in absentia of sedition against the Soviet state and agreed to testify before the U.S. Congressional Committee against Roosevelt for being friendly to the USSR, and was eventually killed as the Second World War was breaking out, while he was actively urging the labor movement to be neutral and not cooperate with Allied mobilizations against the Nazis. At the time of his death, Trotsky was fundamentally at odds with both Soviet and American foreign policy and regarded as a Nazi sympathizer and fifth column element by both governments. Trotsky's followers in the United States were imprisoned for trying to unionize the army and disrupt the war effort, and the Communist Party celebrated their imprisonment. Neoconservatives glorify the U.S. victory in the Second World War and regard Hitler as the prototype for all illiberal and authoritarian governments. Neoconservatives view the United States as having a noble mission to spread freedom and were anti-communist in a completely different way than Trotsky had been anti-Soviet. Trotsky's theory of permanent revolution and efforts to spread freedom by overthrowing governments in the developing world simply do not line up at all, and this is apparent to those familiar with the subject. A much less politically correct narrative, rooted in classical anti-Semitism, has emerged as well. The narrative has been lurking in the background and is now blasted across social media by Nick Fuentes. The claim is that Bolshevism and Zionist neoconservatism are both expressions of the evil Jewish people and their satanic plot against European civilization. This narrative is also rather delusional. Trotsky was more anti-Zionist than Stalin was, and after his death, Stalin enabled the State of Israel to come into existence in 1948 within the United Nations, while Trotskyites maintained their opposition to it throughout the 1950s and up into the 1980s. When opposition to Israel was taboo among leftists, Trotskyites were among the most outspoken critics of Israel. Vanessa Redgrave, an actress who was a member of the Workers' Revolutionary Party, led by Jerry Healy, condemned Zionist hoodlums from the stage of the Academy Awards in 1978. Trotsky was killed primarily because he was seen by the Soviet government as opposing the Allied position in the Second World War and aiding Hitler by seeking to spread anti-war sentiments within the labor movement. If he was part of a vast, quote, Judeo plot, it is unlikely he'd be perceived as cooperating with the perpetrators of the Holocaust. To view Trotsky as an agent of a Judeo-Bolshevik cabal against the white man fits shallow far-right narratives that have been around for generations, but it doesn't match the nuances of the facts. The real story of how and why various New York intellectuals who were members of the Socialist Workers' Party and its organizational predecessors ultimately ended up being Republican war hawks by the 1970s is very interesting and nuanced. rather than highlighting a hatred for freedom by totalitarians or a supposed Judeo-Bolshevik plot. The story actually says a lot more about the collective West. It points to very important realities about the problems Western countries are facing, both internally and internationally. In these times, Israel and Zionism is a factor in the story, but not the primary one. This is a story that is complex but important, and it must be told, and I am happy to tell it. This book is being written in the direct aftermath of Putin and Trump meeting in Alaska. As we hope for peace and a resolution of the brutal conflict that was, in reality, proxy forces of NATO battling Russia at the cost of over 1 million lives, we must examine why Western civilization is in crisis and what is driving these endless wars. This book will point to answers that are urgently needed by examining the intellectual trajectory of those chosen by those who rule over us to direct not just foreign policy, but art, culture, and philosophy. How did they go from Trotskyism to neoconservatism? Read and learn. These are the facts. Chapter 1, Leon Trotsky's Life and Death. Lev Bronstein, who eventually became known to the world as Leon Trotsky, was born in 1879 in Kherson, a region of the Russian Empire that is currently contested between Russia and Ukraine on the battlefield, and was considered part of Ukraine when the borders were first drawn up during the early years of the Soviet Union. He was born to a Jewish family and sent to study in Odessa as a young man. No doubt his family experienced a huge amount of anti-Semitism. Hatred of Jews was widespread in the Russian Empire, and pogroms against Jewish villages were regularly mobilized. The deeply religious Russian peasantry tended to be the most virulent in their contempt for Jews as a group of others who were considered untrustworthy and morally questionable due to their non-Christian religious beliefs and their historical involvement in money lending. As a young man, Trotsky got involved in Russia's revolutionary intelligentsia, which was vast. Russia remained a medieval autocracy and an empire, while Europe had experienced all kinds of revolutions, creating democratic republics and modern nation states. Feudal relations were largely intact, and many of Russia's educated strata wanted their country to modernize and move toward a more Western-style government and economic system. The vast networks of educated young men trading illegal pamphlets talking about toppling Tsarism, creating a more egalitarian society, rushing to support peasant revolts and strikes, and occasionally engaging in terrorist bombings or assassinations were a big part of Russian society in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The revolutionary intelligentsia is a topic of many popular novels by Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and Gorky. The constitutional Democrats, or cadets, were the Russians who advocated a Western-style liberal democratic government. In addition to them, there were the Narodniks, a group that advocated the peasants rising up against the landlords. The Narodniks were widely mocked in Russia as an embarrassing and failing radical trend. Wealthy students would dress up as poor peasants and go live among the rural farm workers, hoping to incite them to revolt. Eventually, Peter Kropotkin would become the most well-known intellectual voice for a movement of rural anarchists, and his manifesto, The Conquest of Bread, is still studied by middle-class radicals right up to today. Trotsky was convinced to abandon Narodnikism and became a Marxist by a woman who eventually became his first wife, the revolutionary activist Alexandria Sokolovskaya. The Marxist movement in Russia had been founded by Georgy Plekhanov and defined itself as focusing on organizing industrial workers rather than the rural poor. From the emancipation of labor group and various Marxist factions that had sought to lend the economic struggle a political character by building a political party that supported labor unions, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party eventually emerged. Trotsky was an effective writer and orator and became a respected voice among the Russian Marxists. In 1903, Trotsky was invited to a meeting of Russian radicals in London, where Vladimir Lenin pitched his concept of a party of new type. centered around a theoretical journal, Iskra. The majority of those in the room accepted Lenin's proposal and became the Bolsheviks. The minority, who represented the majority of Russian Marxists, rejected the proposal and became known as the Mensheviks. Trotsky was sympathetic to Iskra, and he wrote articles for it, and he shared many of Lenin's critiques of the Mensheviks and their ineffective strategy of tailism and building a loose organization. However, when the Bolsheviks moved to create their own organization and expel the Mensheviks in 1912, Trotsky rejected the idea. He proposed the August Bloc, which was to be a more radical faction within the Mensheviks, a militant minority that would push the wider Russian Marxist organization in a more revolutionary direction. When the Bolsheviks formally expelled the Mensheviks in 1912, Trotsky went with the Mensheviks and formed his new organization. The group that came out of Trotsky's August Bloc was formerly called the Russian Social Democratic Party Internationalist and commonly called the Interdistrictites because they represented a compromised position between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. Trotsky spent the bulk of his life before the 1917 revolution in exile. In Paris, Vienna, Berlin, and various other cities that were home to bohemian districts of wealthy radicals, Trotsky filled auditoriums with his lectures given in the various languages he spoke. His books sold in large numbers. He became one of the most well-known Marxist writers and a kind of representative of the Russian revolutionary opposition to Western audiences. Trotsky's defining belief was a concept called the permanent revolution, which he admitted had first been conceived by Alexander Parvus. The idea was that impoverished and semi-feudal countries could indeed become led by the working class after a revolution, something that the Mensheviks denied. Countries like Russia were still largely agrarian and not industrialized, could then become base areas to spread a working class revolution to the centers of the global economy in the West and bring communism to the entire world. As Trotsky explained when republishing his pamphlet Results and Prospects, his theory teaches, once having power, the proletariat cannot keep within the limits of bourgeois democracy. It must adopt tactics of permanent revolution, go over to more and more radical reforms, and seek to support a revolution in Western Europe. As Peter Camejo explained in his introduction to Trotsky's work on the subject of permanent revolution, the interpretation of Marxism Trotsky put forward, quote, did not conceive of a socialist society except as a world system, which would not only have a higher level of production and consumption, but far more freedoms than the most advanced liberal capitalisms. It could not be erected, as the Stalinists were to teach, in a single country, let alone a backward one at that. The development of socialism in a country like Russia, and really anywhere else in the world, according to Trotsky, was dependent on the victory of the working class in the colonial homelands. What is now called the collective West was the center of Trotsky's universe, and would always be so, despite his birth elsewhere. He called New York City the foundry where the fate of mankind will be forged. Lenin's groundbreaking work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, said the revolutionary energy of the world was shifting to the East and the colonized world. Lenin predicted that it would not be the struggles between workers and employers, but the struggle of entire nations for liberation from imperialist domination that would bring socialism into the world. Trotsky never accepted this worldview. Lenin wanted the Russian revolutionaries to mobilize both the peasantry and the workers, and he called for a revolutionary dictatorship of workers and peasants. He sought to raise the demand of peasants for land redistribution as a way to align them with the working class. Trotsky saw peasants as inherently backward and condemned mobilizing an alliance with the peasantry, writing, quote, but whatever conditions may be, the proletariat must clearly see as its path and take it consciously. Above everything else, it must be free from illusions. And the worst illusion from all history is that the proletariat has taken until now has been reliance on others. He wrote, the less it adapts to passivity and limitations of petty bourgeois and peasantry, the more resolute and irreconcilable its fight becomes. Nothing, of course, will be accomplished by putting forward mere slogans such as "for the confiscation of land." Alexander Parvus, the mentor of Trotsky, to whom he credited his theory of permanent revolution, was a Russian-born Marxist who eventually moved to Germany and became elected to the Reichstag as a social democrat. Parvus, we now know, was a primary asset of the German secret police. He was an arms dealer for the Ottoman Empire. He later arranged for Lenin to return to Russia from exile amid the revolutionary turmoil of 1917, something he did on behalf of German intelligence in the hopes that Lenin would sow confusion and weaken Russia's role in the war. One of Trotsky's primary activities during the pre-war years was to advocate for a United States of Europe. The idea was that all of the Western nations would merge into a single country, a European Union. This would break down national barriers and create working class solidarity. Lenin vehemently opposed the idea, saying it would strengthen the power of the Western imperialist monopolies and their ability to plunder the world. Lenin argued that it was also in the interests of workers and oppressed to divide the Western countries and further divisions among the colonial powers. Lenin's essay, Imperialism and the Split in Socialism, lampooned this concept. Nevertheless, as early as 1902, he had an excellent insight into the meaning and significance of the United States of Europe, be it said for the benefit of Trotsky, the Kautskyite, and all that is now being glossed over by hypocritical Kautskyites of various countries, namely that the opportunists and social chauvinists are working hand in glove with the imperialist bourgeoisie precisely toward creating an imperialist Europe on the backs of Asia and Africa, and that objectively the opportunists are a section of the petty bourgeoisie and of a certain strata of the working class who have been bribed out of imperialist super profits and converted to watchdogs of capitalism and corruptors of the labor movement. As far as Lenin was concerned, the bulk of the European Marxist parties and labor unions had been bought off and were used by the Western monopolies to mobilize working class people to support their wars. Lenin felt it was necessary to form a completely new organization, rejecting social democracy entirely. He wrote, "It is therefore our duty, if we wish to remain socialists, to go down lower and deeper to the real masses. This is the whole meaning and the whole purport of the struggle against opportunism. By exposing the fact that the opportunists and social chauvinists are in reality betraying and selling the interests of the masses, that they are defending the temporary privileges of a minority of the workers, that they are vehicles of bourgeois idea and influences, that they are really allies and agents of the bourgeoisie. We are teaching the masses to appreciate their true political interests, to fight for socialism and for revolution through all the long and painful vicissitudes of imperialist wars and imperialist armistices. The only Marxist line in the labor movement is to explain to the masses the inevitability and necessity of breaking with opportunism, to educate them for revolution by waging a relentless struggle against opportunism, to utilize the experiences of war to expose, not conceal, the utter vileness of national liberal labor politics." Trotsky rejected this notion, instead arguing that European social democracy could be pushed in a better direction. While this position defined Trotsky throughout his life. While Lenin regarded social democracy as the enemy, Trotsky always felt that the wider Western socialist movement and its labor unions were his political home, as much as he might be frustrated by them. He and his movement always sought to be the more radical opposition in a room filled with moderate social democrats and labor bosses, fighting for their position and trying to nudge a part of the Western colonial establishment toward better positions. Lenin's worldview was fundamentally anti-Western. He saw the Western imperialist system as the main barrier to human progress and sought to mobilize the oppressed peoples of the colonized countries of the world against it, and to align the working class of Western countries with them. Trotsky saw the West as the immovable center of the world and believed no revolutionary movement had hope until the West changed its character and went into the hands of the industrial working class. At the time of the Russian Revolution, Trotsky was living in New York City, editing a Russian language Marxist publication. Trotsky was a well-known speaker among radicals and expats, and he gained a reputation for refusing to tip in restaurants, instead giving the waiter a speech how he should form a union. An article from the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture, published on May 20th, 2015, repeats this widely reported anecdote. Leon Trotsky refused to tip, so the story goes. In 1917, when he lived for 10 weeks in the Bronx, he would lunch in Jewish immigrant cafes. There, he not only declined to tip, but would also instruct the other customers to follow his example. Neither of these actions endeared him to the waiters, who would spill soup on him as revenge. Trotsky remained unmoved. Eventually, the waiters refused to serve him, which, it turns out, was Trotsky's goal. Tipping, he believed, subsidized unfair labor practices. If the waiters were to be paid enough, tipping would be unnecessary. Until then, they should refuse to do their jobs. When the Tsar abdicated, Trotsky and many other Russian exiled revolutionaries headed home. Trotsky's organization merged into the Bolsheviks in July of 1917. After the seizure of power in the October Revolution, Trotsky became the foreign minister of the Soviet government. He was assigned the important task of negotiating peace with Germany. The Bolsheviks had taken power on the slogan, "Peace, Land, and Bread," and the primary political demand that had propelled them toward war was their promise to end the war. However, many Bolshevik leaders felt that now that they were in power, a different war could be waged against Germany, one of a revolutionary character. Lenin vehemently disagreed and insisted the Bolsheviks keep their promises and end involvement in the First World War as they had promised to do. Trotsky was dispatched to negotiate the terms of ending the conflict with the Germans. The press reported that when he was meeting to negotiate the treaty, he stalled, engaging in debate rising to subtle discussion of first principles that ranged far beyond the concrete territorial issues that divided them. Trotsky made a point of disrespecting the German delegation and lecturing them on the revolutionary ideals of the new regime. He returned to Moscow with no treaty and announced that the new Soviet government could have no war but no peace, and demobilize fighting without ever signing a treaty with the Germans. Lenin was absolutely furious, and ultimately the Bolsheviks signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ceding huge swaths of territory as a result of Trotsky's mismanagement. Trotsky resigned as foreign minister. From 1917 to 1921, the Soviet government waged a civil war against foreign invaders and domestic enemies. Millions died in an ugly conflict that involved many brutal massacres of civilians, with the entire country suffering from a blockade that prevented food and medicine from being imported. Trotsky became the public face of the Red Army. Trotsky's autobiography tells how he spent the war, in which hundreds of thousands died, were wounded, or held the line out in the freezing cold, inside the warmth of a train car that went from base to base. He recalled, "The arrival of the train put the most isolated unit in touch with the whole army and brought it into life, not only of the country, but of the entire world. Alarmist rumors and doubts were dispelled, and the spirits of men grew firm. This change of morale would last for several weeks, sometimes until the next visit of the train. In the intervals, members of the Revolutionary Military Council of the Front or of the Army would make small trips in character, but smaller on scale." Trotsky was not exaggerating about the impact he had on the morale of the troops. His staged visits to military encampments revealed that he had a high level of skill in the art of propaganda. His visits became elaborate propaganda shows, informal rallies to inspire passion among the soldiers. He would arrange for deserters to be lined up before the firing squads to be executed. and he would arrive just in time to save their lives. He would address crowds of soldiers dressed in an elaborate, expensive costume consisting of leather pants, a leather jacket, and a military visor. He would give fiery speeches to inspire the soldiers to fight for the Bolshevik cause. And he would end his speech by pulling a gold watch from his pocket and awarding it as a prize to a random soldier to thunderous applause from the crowd. It is likely that the Nazi rallies of Nuremberg a few decades later took some inspiration from them, as Goebbels openly praised Bolshevik propaganda, such as the film The Battleship Potemkin. Trotsky was very skilled at exuding the kind of passion, rage, and fanaticism that accompanied all major political movements as the 20th century proceeded, and one could call him a pioneer of the modernist war aesthetic. Once the Civil War was won, the Bolsheviks had to wrangle with the question of how to hold the country together and increase living standards. Trotsky proposed to continue the policy of war communism indefinitely, militarizing the economy and using military methods to mobilize industrial production. Lenin disagreed and pushed for the new economic policy. As Lenin explained, a group of party workers headed by Trotsky, intoxicated by the successes achieved by the military methods in the army, supposes that those methods can and must be adopted among the workers and the trade unions in order to achieve similar successes in strengthening the unions and in reviving industry. But this group forgets that the army and the working class are two different spheres, and that a method that is suitable for the army might prove unsuitable and harmful among the working class and trade unions. Obviously, though normal methods of proletarian democracy in the unions, only methods of persuasion can make it possible to unite the working class, to stimulate its independent activity and strengthen its confidence in Soviet power. Confidence that is much needed in order to rouse the country for the struggle against economic ruin. After Lenin's death, the Bolsheviks debated the way forward. Trotsky continued to push his theory of permanent revolution, aiming for the USSR to exist as a base area for spreading workers' revolution to the Western countries. Trotsky's left opposition was defeated, as was Bukharin's right opposition, with Stalin solidifying his position of socialism in one country in 1927. Trotsky vehemently disagreed with the Communist International's support for the nationalist KMT government of China. He viewed Sun Yat-sen's government as bourgeois nationalist and argued that the Chinese communists should oppose it and build some kind of working class opposition party. Stalin, the Communist International, took the opposite position and directed communists to join the KMT. The Soviet Union also built a military training school in China and aided the Chinese Republic in fighting local warlords who opposed it. This policy resulted in the Communist Party of China expanding in big numbers as the pro-Soviet wing of the ruling party. Trotsky fumed with anger about how enthusiastically the Chinese communists were functioning as members of the KMT. Communists do not simply join the Kuomintang, but they submit to its discipline and even obligate themselves not to criticize Sun Yat-senism. Under these conditions, the petty bourgeois intellectual can only trail behind the nationalist liberal bourgeoisie, which is bound by imperceptible gradations with the compradorian, overtly imperialist bourgeoisie. In 1927, Chiang Kai-shek launched his White Terror to suppress the communists, and they fled to the countryside, forming their own Red Army and launching the People's War that would eventually propel them to power. Trotsky blamed Stalin and the Communist International for the 1927 Red Terror, saying the policy of supporting the KMT had set the Chinese communists up to be massacred. He wrote, "The Chinese Revolution was an examination of the new role of Stalin by the inverse method. Having conquered power in the USSR with the aid of the strata who have been breaking away from the international revolution, and with indirect but very real aid of hostile classes, Stalin automatically became the leader of the Comintern, and by that alone, the leader of the Chinese Revolution. The passive hero of the behind-the-scenes apparatus mechanism had to show his method and quality in the events of the great revolutionary flow. Within this lies the tragic paradox of Stalin's role in China. Stalin's leadership in the Chinese Revolution is just the fruit of the combination of theoretical, political, and national limitedness with huge apparatus power. Stalin has proved himself incapable of learning. The undertaking of the Second Chinese Revolution, the undertaker of the Second Chinese Revolution, is preparing before our very eyes to strangle the Chinese Revolution at its inception. Years later, as Mao's peasant army was heroically battling Japan, becoming the heroes of the global anti-fascist movement, with best-selling books like Red Star Over China documenting Mao's military brilliance, Trotsky maintained his suspicion. He argued that as a largely peasant country, China's revolution was tainted by this reactionary class. He wrote, "It's one thing when a communist party, firmly resting upon the flower of the urban proletariat, strives through the workers to lead a peasant war. It is altogether different when a few thousand or 10,000 revolutionists who are truly communists or take the name assume the leadership of a peasant war without serious support from the working class. This is precisely the situation in China. In old China, every peasant uprising was concluded by the creation of a new dynasty and subsequently a new large group of proprietors. The movement was caught in a vicious cycle. Under the present conditions, the peasant war by itself, without the direct leadership of the proletarian vanguard, can only pass power to a new bourgeois clique." Trotsky's contempt for the peoples of the East and his rejection of the Leninist understanding that revolutionary energy has shifted in the colonized world due to imperialism was hard to conceal. His book, Stalin: An Appraisal, published in 1940, begins with a tirade that cannot be described as anything but racist, attributing Stalin's alleged tyrannical methods to his background as a Georgian. Quote, the late Leonid Krasin, old revolutionist, eminent engineer, brilliant Soviet diplomat, and above all, intelligent human being, was the first, if I am not mistaken, to call Stalin Asiatic, in saying that he had in mind no problematic racial attributes, but rather the blending of grit, shrewdness, craftiness, and cruelty, which has been considered characteristic of the statesmen of Asia. Bukharin subsequently simplified the appellation, calling Stalin Genghis Khan, manifestly in order to draw attention to his cruelty, which had developed into brutality. Stalin himself, in a conversation with a Japanese journalist, once called himself Asiatic, not in the old but rather new sense of the word. With his personal allusion, he wished to hint at the existence of common interests between the USSR and Japan as against the imperialistic West. Contemplating the term Asiatic from a scientific viewpoint, we must admit that in this instance, it is at least partially correct. Trotsky fled the USSR, first to Turkey, later to France, and ultimately to Mexico. From exile, he built a network of followers who were expelled from the various communist parties around the world. As the world saw it, the Trotskyites were the other communists. An article from Time magazine, dated March 6, 1940, compared the Communist International in Moscow to the Vatican and presented the Trotskyites as Protestants. Nothing so maddens Marxists as to have Marxism called a religion, hence, by their definition, opium. Nevertheless, Marxism has a Bible, Das Kapital, its God, dialectical materialism, its Pope, Stalin, saints, Marx, Engels, and Lenin, martyrs, Liebknecht and Luxemburg, doctrine, the communist line. As in other religions, heresies and schisms crop up occasionally. Heretics are sometimes exiled, often handed over to the secular arm or shot, always excommunicated. Most serious heresy in the eyes of Stalinist true believers is Trotskyism, whose heresiarch is Leon Trotsky, now in exile in Mexico. Trotsky's heretical sect styles itself the Fourth International, with 5,000 communicants. Until last week, its U.S. congregation was the Socialist Workers' Party, 2,000, which hard-bitten James Patrick Cannon and full-lipped Max Shachtman were co-pastors. Marxism was the ideology of the labor movement, a critical force in the Western world during the 1930s. Labor unions were traditionally run by social democrats, but communists challenged them, pushing an anti-imperialist political line and celebrating the Soviet Union as a homeland of global revolution. Trotskyism emerged as a third pole within organized labor, celebrating the Russian Revolution, but considering it to have been betrayed. Trotsky maintained the USSR was a degenerated workers' state. He called for a political revolution to overturn the parasitical bureaucracy. In the early 1930s, the Communist International focused on opposing the Social Democrats, calling them social fascists, and labeling them the main barrier preventing a revolution. As the Great Depression hit, the Communists organized huge protests of unemployed workers and veterans. The hunger marches in the United States, Britain, France, and Germany resulted in millions of desperately poor people coming under communist leadership. In Berlin, the communists launched an uprising in the Wedding district that went on for weeks with armed battles against the police. Trotsky opposed the focus on condemning Social Democrats, saying that they should be recruited as allies in a united front. His followers joined various social democratic parties in the hopes of making them more revolutionary, a policy similar to what he had pushed years earlier with his August Bloc, now called the French Turn. When Hitler took power in Germany in 1933, Trotsky proclaimed that this was Stalin's fault. If only the German Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party had combined, Hitler could have been blocked, or so the Trotskyite narrative goes. This is absurd, as the German Social Democrats, the party of industrial workers who had murdered Rosa Luxemburg, wanted nothing to do with the Soviet-aligned Communist Party, which recruited heavily among the desperately poor. A river of blood existed between the two organizations going back to 1918, and by 1933, they represented two very different social strata. The idea of them merging into an anti-fascist bloc, as many social democrats and communists clearly would have wanted, was simply impossible. Trotsky spoke of Hitler taking power without a shot fired and condemned the communists of Germany for not taking up arms immediately against the new government. This was also a naive cheap shot, as the communists maintained a very effective underground network throughout the 1930s, rescuing Jews from concentration camps, passing military secrets to the Soviet Union, and otherwise helping pave the way for the Allied victory in the Second World War. A suicidal uprising in response to Hitler taking power by legal means would have led to this all being wiped away. In 1935, the Communist International dramatically shifted tactics and called for forming an alliance with all who opposed fascism. The new line was called the Popular Front and was articulated by Georgy Dimitrov in his remarks to the Seventh World Congress. The understanding was that capitalism was naturally moving toward fascism, and communists could position themselves as the main fighters against it, an essential linchpin in anti-fascist coalitions. This tactical shift resulted in communists having a huge amount of success, as fascism was unpopular even among many in the ruling class. In Britain, the communists organized the Battle of Cable Street to repel Oswald Mosley. In the United States, the Popular Front policies meant supporting Roosevelt, and the Communist Party flourished as part of the New Deal coalition. 1937, the sit-down strike wave resulted in the communist-led Congress of Industrial Organizations breaking away from the AFL and bringing hundreds of thousands of workers into unions that they controlled. Trotsky considered the Popular Front to be a betrayal and said that there was no democratic or fascist bourgeoisie, and that it was necessary to form a class line and unite social democrats and labor unionists, but not with any political faction among the capitalists. While this was Trotsky's stated position of class independence, it seemed that in practice, he more and more began to line up with the Axis powers and the capitalists who supported them as he maneuvered against the communists, working to undermine any attempts to build an anti-fascist coalition. The Nazis worked very hard to foment anti-Soviet sentiment among Ukrainians. Many ethnic Germans in Soviet Ukraine, including Mennonite communities that fled to Ukraine following the 1848 revolution, viewed the Soviet government as a continuation of Russian chauvinism. The Nazis fomented Ukrainian nationalism, with Stepan Bandera eventually emerging as the primary Nazi collaborator during the Second World War. Trotsky, interestingly, also embraced Ukrainian nationalism during the late 1930s, calling for an independent Soviet Ukraine and urging his followers to support Ukrainian nationalists and their call to break apart the Soviet Union. When the Spanish Republic battled an insurgency from fascist General Francisco Franco, the communists of the world mobilized international brigades, bringing volunteers from around the world to defend the Republic. Franco famously remarked when looking to seize power in Barcelona that he had 4 columns inside the city and a 5th column, 4 columns outside the city and a 5th column inside. The 5th column Franco referred to was the CNT, an anarcho-syndicalist labor union, and the PUM, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, a Trotsky-aligned party in Spain. Both of these groups launched an armed uprising against the Spanish Republic at the same time it was battling Franco in May of 1937. Documents now confirm that both CNT and PUM were receiving covert support from the Germans and Italians, as they organized strikes and disruptions of the war effort against Franco. George Orwell fought with the Trotskyites of PUM and composed his screed Homage to Catalonia, blaming the Soviet Union for Franco's victory and describing the Trotskyite and anarchist uprisings against the Spanish Republic. At the 1937 Moscow trials, Trotsky was convicted in absentia for conspiring with Nikolai Bukharin and Gregory Zinoviev to overthrow Stalin with German and Japanese support. The Moscow trials showed evidence that many found very convincing, including U.S. Ambassador Joseph Davies. Zinoviev and Bukharin confessed to being involved in a conspiracy to carry out a political revolution. Trotsky wrote of carrying out the political revolution Trotsky wrote of and seize power from Stalin. The plan was to hand over a large amount of Soviet territory to the Nazis and put their bloc of rights and Trotskyites in control of the rest of the country. Trotsky maintained his innocence and staged the Dewey Commission in Mexico City, hiring U.S. intellectual John Dewey to preside over it. He ended the event with a speech called "I Stake My Life," claiming that if the commission found he was indeed guilty, he would return to the Soviet Union and be executed. Many critics looked at the Dewey Commission as nothing more than an act of political theater, and Dewey and Trotsky had a nasty falling out shortly afterwards. Dewey denounced Trotsky for allegedly believing that the ends justify the means, and Trotsky thundered back in his book, Their Morals and Ours. In America, the Trotskyites worked in the labor movement to oppose President Roosevelt and the Communist Party's alliance with him on the basis of anti-fascism. The Trotskyites worked within the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, a Republican-aligned labor union that opposed Roosevelt. When the Second World War broke out, the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party was indicted and imprisoned for conspiring to unionize the military and disrupt the war effort. With its leaders in prison, the SWP supported the United Mine Workers of America, led by Republican John L. Lewis, in organizing an illegal strike during the war, forcing the Roosevelt administration to seize the mines in 1943. As Roosevelt grew increasingly close to the Communist Party in the late 1930s, with Eleanor Roosevelt speaking at the National Youth Congress and other communist-led events, Martin Dies formed a congressional committee to investigate, quote, un-American activities. Various communists were called to testify about connections with Roosevelt. Trotsky was invited to appear before the Dies committee to speak on why the, quote, Stalinist government was to be opposed and why Roosevelt's connections with it were a matter of concern. Explaining his decision to speak to an anti-communist congressional hearing, Trotsky wrote, I was defeated because the working class, as a result of internal and external conditions, showed itself to be too weak to liquidate its own bureaucracy. The struggle against this deception is an elementary political task. A congressional committee is just as suitable in this fight as the workers' press and the national legislative bodies. When the workers understand the reactionary historical role of Stalinism, they will themselves turn away from it with aversion. In order to help the workers, I agreed to appear before the Dies Committee. The Dies Committee ultimately rescinded its invitation, and Trotsky was not given an opportunity to address the U.S. public over the airwaves. However, the newspapers of William Randolph Hearst frequently published his anti-Soviet articles condemning the Communist Party and the Roosevelt administration for being friendly to the Soviet Union. In 1939, the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler. Trotsky argued the pact was carried out in an unprincipled way, but admitted that it was ultimately the correct move. When the Communist Party and the Roosevelt administration were suddenly at loggerheads, Trotsky called on his followers to endorse Earl Browder's 1940 presidential campaign. While Trotsky consistently opposed the Soviet Union and its allies, at the moment when they were tactically softening their anti-fascist stance and criticizing the allies, Trotsky suddenly was willing to embrace them. This sudden shift seems to be pretty solid confirmation of his fascist backing when lined up next to his position on Ukraine and Spain. The only time Trotsky's knee-jerk anti-Sovietism seemed to have cooled was when it matched a similar pivot in the foreign policy of the Nazis. When France was conquered by Hitler, Trotsky condemned the Communist International for trying to build an anti-fascist alliance, writing, "But in line with the general causes of catastrophe inherent in imperialism, it is impermissible to forget the criminal, sinister role played by the Kremlin and the Comintern. Nobody else rendered such support to Hitler as Stalin. Nobody else created such a dangerous situation for the USSR as Stalin. During a period of 5 years, the Kremlin and its Comintern propagandized for an alliance of democracies and a people's front with the aim of preventing war against fascist aggressors. This propaganda, as witnessed most strikingly in France, had a tremendous influence upon the popular masses." He went on to condemn the idea of the Soviet Union aligning with the Western countries against Hitler. Quote, "The agents of the Kremlin begin to speak once more about an alliance of the democracies against fascist aggressors. It is possible that as the cheated cheater, Stalin will be forced to make a new turn in his foreign politics. But woe to the peoples if they are to trust the dishonest agents of the Kremlin. Stalin helped convert Europe into a bloody chaos and took the USSR to the brink of the abyss. The peoples of the USSR now cannot help but feel great anxiety." The same article went on to proclaim that the only way the Soviet people could be safe from German invasion was to overthrow Stalin. Quote, "Only the overthrow of the Moscow totalitarian clique, only the regeneration of Soviet democracy can unleash the forces of the Soviet people for their fight against the inevitable fascist, fast-approaching blow of imperialist Germany. Hence, Soviet patriotism is inseparable from irreconcilable struggle against the Stalinist clique." Not long after writing these words, Trotsky was killed by a KGB agent who infiltrated his household on August 21st, 1940. This is chapter 2, the 1939 split in the Fourth International. The United States wing of Trotskyism in 1939, the Socialist Workers' Party, was the largest Trotsky-aligned group in the world. This, on the surface, seems a bit odd. Communism and socialism have always been much less popular in the United States than in other Western countries, something that Frederick Engels commented on in an essay during Marx's lifetime and consistently is acknowledged by political scientists as a constant reality, continuing up through the Cold War even to today. Why was the largest outpost of Trotsky's Fourth International in America, of all places? Regardless, the U.S. Socialist Workers' Party was really two parties in one when it was founded, with the Fourth Internationalists leaving the Socialist Party to establish their own organization in 1939. The party had two headquarters, two organizational methods and styles, and two worldviews. The main base of support for American Trotskyism was among labor activists in the Midwest. Farrell Dobbs, Bill Brown, and James Cannon had led the 1934 Teamsters strike under the slogan, "Make Minneapolis a Union Town." The strike committee had effectively seized the city with the no scab trucks, with the rule no scab trucks and pickets smashing windshields with baseball bats to enforce it. The Teamsters had brought in a layer of Trotskyites as organizers and waged the siege of the Midwest, unionizing truck drivers and factory workers in Nebraska, Iowa, and Wisconsin. The Teamster bosses hated Roosevelt and the Democratic Party, their rivals in the struggle to get dues-paying members and closed shop contracts. The Trotskyites had the same enemy, the Communist Party, which was following Moscow's Popular Front line, supporting Roosevelt and the Democrats in the anti-fascist front. However, in addition to the labor activist base in the Midwest, the Trotskyites had a large number of members in New York City. James Cannon explains in his History of American Trotskyism how this came about due to frustrating circumstances that set the stage for the 1939 split. By the time the Second World War broke out, the Communist Party controlled two major city council seats in Harlem, with Benjamin Davis and Peter Cascioni elected as card-carrying Communist Party members. Vito Marcantonio, a close ally of the Communist Party and member of its fraternal organization, the International Workers' Order, was elected to the House of Representatives. The Communist Party owned a large building near Union Square, and Communist Party boss Earl Browder was a kingmaker inside the New York Democratic Party machine. Browder was frequently called to Washington to meet with the Roosevelt administration, and during the Second World War, he met with the State Department to consult on war mobilization efforts. With Soviet-aligned communism being a New York City institution, it created many discontents. Many people joined the Communist Party and got burned. This was especially true as the Popular Front policies did not match the revolutionary reputation of communism. Communism was supposed to be a revolutionary ideology, inspiring workers to overthrow the bosses. But during the Popular Front years, it meant a kind of pro-Soviet, anti-racist, anti-fascism wrapped in the American flag, with talk of eventually establishing a centrally planned economy. Many disappointed people who felt the Communist Party was not radical enough or had simply had their feathers ruffled on an organizational level joined the Trotskyites. Cannon reflected in his History of American Trotskyism, quote, "Every new movement attracts certain elements, which might properly be called the lunatic fringe. Freaks looking for the most extreme expression of radicalism, misfits, windbags, and chronic oppositionists who have been thrown out of half a dozen organizations. Such people began to come to us in our isolation shouting, 'Hello, comrades.' I was always against admitting such people, but the tide was too strong. I waged a bitter fight in the New York branch of the Communist League against admitting a man solely because of his appearance and dress. Many people came to us who had revolted against the Communist Party, not for its bad sides, but for its good sides. That is, the discipline of the party, the subordination of the individual to the decisions of the party and the current work. A lot of dilettantish, petty bourgeois-minded people who had either left the CP or been expelled from it, wanted, or rather thought they wanted, to become Trotskyists. Some of them joined the New York branch and brought with them that same prejudice against discipline in our organization. Many of the newcomers made a fetish for democracy. They were repelled so much by the bureaucratism of the Communist Party that they desired an organization without any authority or discipline or centralization, whatever. But beyond just the problem of attracting primarily the Communist Party's misfits and rejects, the Trotskyites had another organizational issue in New York City. They increasingly became a home for intellectuals and writers who were attracted to the revolutionary politics, but did not want to be identified with the Soviet Union's problematic reputation. As Cannon explained, quote, Trotskyism became more popular in petty bourgeois, intellectual, and half-intellectual circles. For a time, it became the fashion. Party membership conferred a certain distinction and imposed no serious hardships. Internal democracy was exaggerated to the point of looseness. Centralism and discipline existed only in the program and not in the practice. The party in New York was more like a sophisticated discussion club than a combat party of the proletariat. Alan M. Wald explained in his book, The New York Intellectuals, Trotskyism made it possible for these rebellious intellectuals to declare on the side of revolution and yet denounce Stalin from the left as an arch betrayer of Lenin's heritage. Harry Ring, a leader of the Socialist Workers' Party based in Newark, New Jersey, in the late 1930s, described the atmosphere where the New York City branch of the party was consumed by, quote, young intellectuals. He explained, you had a particular moment within the youth movement, that is to say, the fallacious notion that what was decisive was not the party, but the youth organization, and that the youth was the vanguard, and the party was a bunch of old fuddy-duddies. They pay the rent, but the youth movement, that's the real revolutionary movement. There was no future for young intellectuals in the bourgeois world. There were no careers open to them. Many of them, including some brilliant intellectuals, turned briefly to the revolutionary movement. But then, as soon as things got better, when the war and prosperity came in and the jobs started opening up and things weren't tough for the intellectuals, we began to see this very rapid exodus from our movement. Irving Kristol reflected on his memories of being a Trotskyist at City College during the late 1930s in a piece for the New York Times. He explained the atmosphere. The only alcoves that mattered to me were number one and number two, the alcoves of the anti-Stalinist left and the pro-Stalinist left, respectively. It was between these two alcoves that the War of the Worlds was fought over the faceless bodies of the mass of students, whom we tried desperately to manipulate into the right position, but about whom, to tell you the truth, we knew little and cared less. Most of the students from Jewish, working class, or lower middle class backgrounds with a socialist tint were spontaneously sympathetic to the New Deal and FDR. The really left-wing groups, though, larger than elsewhere, were a distinct minority. Alcove number two, by far the most populous of the political alcoves, could rarely mobilize more than 400 or 500 out of the total enrollment of 20,000, perhaps, students for a protest or an action. We in alcove number one numbered about 30 regulars, and we were lucky to get an attendance of 50 to 100 at one of ours. But then, as now, student government and student politics were a minority affair, and what the passive majority thought didn't really matter. What happened on campus was determined by them, the denizens of alcove number two, or us. In truth, very little did happen. But at the time, what did seem terribly important. During the first 3 years, they controlled the college newspaper. In my last year, we got control. It was a glorious victory. And I do think we went on to publish a slightly less mendacious newspaper, but I haven't even a vague remembrance of what we wrote. I shall not say much about alcove number two, the home of the pro-Stalinist left. But Lord, how dreary a bunch they seemed to be. I thought then, with sectarian snobbery that comes so easily to young radicals, that they didn't and never would amount to much. One is now a scientist at a major university. The other was Julius Rosenberg. I do believe their dreariness was a fact, and that their dreariness in turn had something to do with the political outlook they took it upon themselves to espouse. These were young college students who, out of sympathy with communism as officially established in the Soviet Union, had to publicly justify the Moscow trials and the bloody purge of the old Bolsheviks, had to publicly accept the self-glorification of Stalin as the exemplar of communist virtue. Though I had no trouble understanding how a young man at the time could have joined the Young Communist League or one of its fronts, I did find it hard to imagine how he stayed there. Not everyone did stay, of course. Many of the members of alcove number one had their first political experience with a Stalinist group and had left in disillusionment. Ring described his experience in the New York Youth Organization in these years. Quote, another young intellectual who was considered very promising, he was only 17 or 18 at the time, was Irving Howe, now a right-wing social democrat. He was not much more appealing then. I remember I was in Newark, going to New York, going to the big city to attend the youth meeting in New York, and they were having an educational discussion led by Irving Howe and a big debate on the problem of political morality, Bolshevik morality. The question was posed by Irving Howe. Suppose you knew that one of our opponents in the party had committed a class crime like crossing a picket line or something, but you were the only witness, and it was your word against his, and you couldn't really prove that he did it. Would you have the right to tell the party that he did it? There's a big labor struggle, a big radical struggle going on, but this was the question they were debating in New York. Well, I got back on the tubes to Newark, and I didn't go in much anymore. Ring explained that the youth organization aligned itself with a layer of writers. Literary figures, intellectual figures, academic figures. Trotskyism was, so to speak, fashionable among the intellectuals in the late 1930s. The principal focal point of these circles was the magazine Partisan Review, which was then a very serious literary and political publication. Such people as Edmund Wilson, Mary McCarthy, Philip Roth. Their association was more so with Trotsky than with Trotskyist ideas. Partisan Review was a magazine that had been created by writers and intellectuals associated with the Communist Party in 1934. Then in 1937, it was relaunched. After 2 years, it ceased publication. Then in 1937, it was relaunched as an anti-Stalinist publication when its owners, Philip Roth and William Phillips, rebooted it and turning against the Soviet Union and its foreign policy. The 1937 relaunch brought onto the editorial board a slew of Ivy League academics, such as Dwight MacDonald, Sidney Hook, and Frederick Dupee, who agreed with its anti-Stalinist position. Among them was James Burnham, the chair of the philosophy department at New York University. Alan M. Wald echoes Ring's recollections about the New York City Trotskyist movement, which had been the subject of much academic analysis, especially in its later trajectory and incarnations. Since the 1960s, there has been a steady stream, now swelling to a torrent of books and articles about this group. Sometimes the New York intellectuals are called the New York family. In popular usage, the term refers to a loose circle of intellectuals whose preeminent forums have been partisan review, commentary, and dissent. Contributors to these journals, who were old enough to be politically active in the 1930s, tended to become, like Sidney Hook, not only anti-Stalinists, but also revolutionary Marxists of one persuasion or other. The young paper box union lawyer Sam Ballin, eventually to be known as Sam Marcy, leader of the Workers' World Party in the post-war years, found the atmosphere in New York City Trotskyism to be completely nauseating during the late 1930s. As a Ukrainian-born activist who focused on labor organizing, he was completely isolated within the Socialist Workers' Party. He eventually recruited labor activist Dorothy Ballin and Shakespearean actor Vincent Copeland to move to Buffalo, New York, and build their own wing of the Trotskyist movement among steelworkers. The clash between the Socialist Workers' Party's labor-oriented wing and these literary and academic Manhattan circles came in the fall of 1939 when the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany. Roosevelt, U.S. media had been somewhat sympathetic to the Soviet Union as an ally against Hitler. Roosevelt had been supported by the U.S. Communist Party. But the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact changed everything. Communists were declared to be hypocrites and insincere in their anti-fascism. Time magazine began calling the Communist Party the Commune Nazis. Though Trotsky criticized the way the Soviet Union and its allies explained the policy, he maintained the USSR had the right to make this alliance, and he said he would have called for it sooner. However, the New York intellectuals disagreed. After the 1939 pact, the Socialist Workers' Party opposition, based almost entirely in New York City, announced opposition on the Russian question. As far as they were concerned, the USSR was no longer a workers' state. Some of them said it was state capitalism, with the party bosses as the new capitalist class. Max Shachtman and James Burnham said it was bureaucratic collectivism, a new economic system of which Nazi Germany was also an example, neither capitalist nor socialist, but ruled by technicians and corporate planners coordinating with the government. The group insisted that the Trotskyist movement completely denounced the Soviet Union, and they also decried an authoritarian culture within the organization. Among the Shachtman-led opposition, there were a few who considered the USSR to still be a degenerated workers' state, but opposed the regime of the party, which they described as authoritarian and stifling of open discussion. James Cannon's book, The Struggle for a Proletarian Party, gives his overall analysis and recollection of the 1939 conflict. He reflected on how closely the feelings of the New York intellectuals were tied in with the overall tone of the U.S. government and establishment. They could stomach the Moscow trials, but not the prospect of coming into collision with the democratic government of U.S. imperialism. After the Soviet invasion of Poland and then of Finland, the fight of the fellow travelers became a rout. This wild migration attracted wide attention and comment. We ourselves contributed our observations and witticisms on this ludicrous spectacle. Up to now, however, we had remained silent on an analogous phenomenon in our own periphery. The flight of the more sophisticated but hardly more courageous intellectual fellow travelers of American Trotskyism had been scarcely less precipitate and catastrophic. With the approach of the war, Trotskyism as a doctrine and a movement came to lose its credibility. Many of the intellectuals, sniffing danger, arranged a somewhat hasty and undignified departure. In truth, there is not much left of that considerable army of drawing room heroes who used to admire Trotsky's literary style and confound the less intelligent periphery of Stalinism with nuggets of wisdom mined from Trotsky's writings. The collapse of the Trotskyist cultural front was taken by some, especially the ex-fronters themselves, to signify a collapse of our movement. The journals of the class enemy to which they promptly attached themselves, some of them, had already worked up the courage to write about Trotskyism as an outmoded sectarian tendency. However, it is they who are outmoded, not the movement of the proletarian vanguard Trotskyism. The petty bourgeois intellectuals are introspective by nature. They mistake their own emotions, their uncertainties, their fears, and their own egotistic concerns about their personal fate for the sentiments and movements of the great masses. They measure the world's agony by their own inconsequential aches and pains. And so far as party membership consists in part of petty bourgeois elements completely disconnected from the proletarian class struggle, the crisis which overtook the periphery of our movement is transferred, or rather extended, into the party. The intellectuals simply couldn't stomach adopting international positions that put them at odds with the U.S. government, and that placed them in a position of having to defend a workers' state, even while denouncing its leaders. As Cannon explained, the driving impulses behind the opposition as a whole are petty bourgeois nervousness at the prospect of impending struggle, difficulties, and sacrifices, and the unconscious desire to avoid them at all costs. For some, no doubt, the frenzied struggle against our program and our tradition is simply a device to mask a capitulatory desertion of the revolutionary movement and a cloud of dust and controversy. The issue was about much more than the Russian question, which the New York intellectuals did not fully agree on. The real point of disagreement was about the relationship of individuals to a political organization. The Russian question just presented an opportunity for the two groups to directly clash. As Cannon pointed out, their inability to give a common answer to the character of the Soviet Stalin regime did not prevent them from forming a common faction in their fight against the, quote, regime in the party. In their eyes, all questions are subordinate to this. Cannon explained that the fight against the regime of the Trotskyist movement was rooted in personalities and a mindset that had developed among the New York branch. Quote, for the proletarian revolutionist, the party is the concentrated expression of his life and purpose. He is bound to it for his life and death. He preaches and practices party patriotism because he knows that his socialist ideal cannot be realized without the party. In his eyes, the crime of crimes is disloyalty or irresponsibility toward the party. The proletarian revolutionist is proud of his party. He defends it before the world on all occasions. The proletarian revolutionist is a disciplined man, since the party cannot exist as a combat organization without discipline. When he finds himself in the minority, he loyally submits to the decision of the party and carries out the decisions while he awaits new events to verify the disputes or new opportunities to discuss them again. The moment his toes are stepped on or he is rebuffed, he forgets all about the interests of the movement and remembers only that his feelings have been hurt. The revolution may be important, but wounded vanity of a petty bourgeois intellectual is more important. He is all for discipline when he is laying down the law to others. But as soon as he finds himself in a minority, he begins to deliver ultimatums and threats to the party majority. As Cannon explained, a culture of individualism, gossip, and lack of party patriotism had long existed within the Trotskyist movement. Almost since the beginning of the Trotskyist movement in this country, more than 11 years ago, its normal development and functioning has been impeded by an internal disease which poisoned the bloodstream of the party organism. The name of this disease is Abernism. The characteristics of Abernism, as they have been consistently and uninterruptedly manifested for 10 years, are clique politics, ceaseless dissemination of gossip and complaints about the party regime, subordination of principled questions to organizational and personal considerations, unprincipled combinationism in every faction fight, and ideological treachery. We are living in serious times. We stand on the eve of grave events and great tests for our movement. People who can be disoriented and swept off their feet by rumors and gossip and unsupported accusations will not be very reliable soldiers in the hard coming days. The petty bourgeoisie, after all, do everything on a small scale. The gossip and slander campaign of our opposition is not a drop in the bucket compared to the torrents of lies, misinformation, and slander that will be poured over the heads of revolutionary fighters in the coming days, the war crisis, through the mighty propaganda mediums of our enemies. And it is to be expected that for long periods of time, we will be gagged and bound hand and foot and have no means of communication with each other. Only those who have thought out their principles and know how to hold them firmly will be able to sustain themselves in such times. It is not difficult to foresee that those who succumbed already at the feeble anticipation of this campaign inside our own party can be engulfed by the first wave of the real campaign. Such comrades need not simply a reassurance about this or that fairy tale. They need a re-education in the principles and methods of Marxist politics. Only then will it be possible to rely on them for future battles. The Workers' Party held its founding meeting in 1940, after there had been a large number of expulsions from the Socialist Workers' Party. The New York intellectuals invited people to the founding event of their movement, accusing the Trotskyist movement of practicing cult of the leader. Cannon quotes them advertising themselves, saying at their organization's meeting, "There you will find an organization that works out its own policies, independent and democratically, to meet the needs and interests of the workers, not to follow a party line laid down by a leader in Moscow or in Mexico City." You see, unlike Cannon, the New York intellectuals thought for themselves. They did not obey Stalin or Trotsky. They were an organization that works out its own policies, and it was freedom and independence that enabled them to echo mainstream media and the US government's sudden abhorrence for the Soviet Union. Such cowardice, dressed up as nonconformity, echoes louder in our times than ever, and has always become characteristic of liberal intellectuals. The three leaders of the opposition, Max Shachtman, James Burnham, and Martin Aburn, were set to lead the new organization that embraced the notion of being a third camp Trotskyist. Trotsky mocked the notion of the third camp, responding to the publication New International that had been seized by the Shachtmanites. Quote, "The very first programmatic articles in the purloined organ already reveal the completely light-mindedness and hollowness of this new anti-Marxist grouping, which now appears under the label Third Camp." What is this animal? There is the camp of capitalism and the camp of the proletariat. But is there perhaps a third camp, a petty bourgeois sanctuary? In the nature of things, it is nothing else. But as always, the petty bourgeois camouflages his camp with the paper flowers of rhetoric. Let us lend our ears. Here is one camp, France and England. There's another camp, Hitler and Stalin, and a third camp, Burnham and Shachtman. The Fourth International turns out for them to be in Hitler's camp. Stalin made this discovery long ago. And so a new great slogan, muddlers and pacifists of the world, all ye suffering from the pinpricks of fate, rally to the third camp. But the whole trouble is that two warring camps do not at all exhaust the bourgeois world. What about all the neutral and semi-neutral countries? What about the United States? Should Italy and Japan be assigned? The Scandinavian countries, India and China? We have in mind not the revolutionary Indian or Chinese workers, but rather India and China as oppressed countries. The schoolboy schemata of the three camps leaves out a trifling detail. the colonial world, the greater portion of mankind. James Burnham might be rightly called the first neoconservative. He was far ahead of many of his comrades in 1939 who eventually followed a similar trajectory. Wald's history explains. At the end of the faction fight in 1940, he attended the meeting that launched the new Workers' Party and then dropped a letter off with the secretary of the Workers' Party headquarters to resign from the party. In the letter, he stated he really had not been a Marxist for some time, and he had no confidence in the organization that he had just founded. James Burnham published his widely reviewed and circulated book, The Managerial Revolution, the following year, in which he laid out his thesis of a new class of managers, neither capitalists nor workers, who now ruled. When the Second World War broke out, Burnham signed up for the Office of Strategic Service and became an intelligence operative. After the war, the Office of Strategic Services became the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency. A conspiratorial mind might wonder if Burnham had been a plant the entire time, as his career as a revolutionary Trotskyist was very short, and his denunciation of Marxism and enlistment in the intelligence services came very quickly. But with the Communist Party functioning as essentially an ally of the Roosevelt administration, representing the Soviet Union, and Trotskyism acting as a wing of Marxism that nudged the influence of the Axis powers in the labor movement, there's no doubt that the U.S. government apparatus, as well as other intelligence services, had their fingers in Trotskyist groups. Whether Burnham, the well-respected college professor who became a Trotskyist, played a role in a dramatic split between Trotsky's followers in New York City and then became a professional spook was ever sincere is a fair question to ask. Partisan Review continued to run Burnham's articles, which became more and more anti-communist, especially in the post-war years as McCarthyism set in. Burnham eventually became the editor of William F. Buckley's National Review and an influential figure in American conservatism. Most of Burnham's colleagues took much longer to politically evolve, though Harry Ring pointed out that many of the young Shachtmanites simply left politics after the war and post-war expansion. Ring reminisced about the Newark wing of Trotskyism, whole group of really talented young intellectuals. I don't think they had been in the movement more than 6 or 8 months when the Shachtman opposition developed, and then went right with Shachtman. They went out with Shachtman, and they went through the Shachtman movement like a dose of salt, and within 2 years, they had been done with the whole business. The Workers' Party continued with Max Shachtman and Martin Aburn in command, with a whole slew of intellectual talent lined up behind them, including Albert Gleutzer, Hal Draper, Irving Howe, and Stan Ware. Chapter 3, Max Shachtman Meets the CIA. The Waldorf Peace Conference of 1949 infuriated the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. It is also a real testament to the strength of the Stalinism that Trotsky and the future neocons seethed with hatred of and defined themselves by opposing. The National Board of the Communist Party USA was in federal prison for conspiring to teach an ideology that might lead to the violent overthrow of the U.S. government. The Communist Party was reduced to functioning as an almost underground organization. With its publications banned from the mail, its members prohibited from receiving Social Security benefits, and the House Un-American Activities Committee investigating people in Hollywood for simply having been friendly to the party decades ago. The FBI routinely visited the jobs of party members to make sure they were unemployable. Congress had already drafted the McCarran Act, which would have allowed for concentration camps to be created for 2 million subversives to be rounded up in a national emergency if it was declared. It was in this atmosphere that the Communist Party pulled off a spectacular feat and won a huge public relations victory in New York City. At the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in Midtown Manhattan, Albert Einstein, Aaron Copland, Will Geer, Dmitry Shostakovich, Howard Fast, W.E.B. Du Bois, Lillian Hellman, Frank Oppenheimer, and many other famous writers, scientists, academics, and artists gathered for a 3-day peace conference supporting the Soviet Union from March 25th to 27th. The Scientific and Cultural Conference for World Peace had been inspired by the Congress of World Intellectuals held in Poland the previous year. The assessment of the events by the House Un-American Activities Committee declared its goals to be, quote, provide a propagandist forum against the Marshall Plan and against the North Atlantic Defense Pact, or NATO, as well as to discredit American culture and extol the virtues of Soviet culture. The FBI was all over the event, photographing each person who walked in the door. A few Canadian communists who had come into town from across the border were dragged out of their hotel rooms and deported. The New York intellectuals would, of course, be strongly opposed to such an event. The Soviet Union was, in their view, not even a deformed workers' state or bureaucrat collectivism or state capitalism, the equivalent of Nazi Germany. The movement aligned with the Soviet Union was an even more acute expression of the illiberalism that they had condemned within the canon regime of the Socialist Workers' Party. The freeborn Trotskyites grouped around Max Shachtman, who had cut their ties with the Fourth International as the Second World War was breaking out, mobilized to protest and denounce the Waldorf Peace Gathering, and put on a conference of their own that opposed the Soviet Union while also criticizing U.S. policy. They got some covert support in doing so from the U.S. intelligence agencies, and this would mark the beginning of an important relationship that would change the course of American politics forever. Max Shachtman is one of the most important figures in post-war American politics. One looks over the big names of the Republican and Democratic administrations of the 1960s and 70s. One will find person after person who was one of his followers or mentees. It's rather ironic that so few people know his name, and that he is generally only referenced among scholars of American Marxism or the history of the Trotskyist movement. He served as the personal advisor to George Meany, the president of the AFL-CIO, the top labor union boss from 1955 to 1979. His personal mentee, Michael Harrington, wrote the best-selling book, The Other America, and served in Lyndon Johnson's administration, designing many of the social programs that were created as part of the War on Poverty. Irving Howe, the founder of Democratic Socialists of America, along with Michael Harrington, was once his follower. Bayard Rustin, the personal advisor to Martin Luther King Jr., largely considered the behind-the-scenes architect of the Civil Rights Movement, was an associate of Shachtman, who worked closely with him in the Socialist Party. C.L.R. James, the well-known African-American academic who composed the book Black Jacobins on the Haitian Revolution, was a one-time Shachtmanite, and his collaborator, Grace Lee Boggs. Gene Kirkpatrick, who served as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations from 1981 to 1985 under Ronald Reagan, was a member of the Young People's Socialist League as a college freshman at Columbia University. Was a member of the Young People's Socialist League and attended Max Shachtman's lectures as a college freshman at Columbia University. Irving Kristol, the intellectual father of neoconservatism, was once a follower of his as well. The academic Nathan Glazer, who taught at Harvard for many years and was harshly critical of the welfare state, was a Shachtmanite at one point, as was his colleague Daniel Bell. Richard Penn Kemble, who directed the U.S. Information Agency, an intelligence propaganda entity under Bill Clinton, was a former Shachtmanite. Carl Gershman, who directed the National Endowment for Democracy from 1984 to 2021, was vice chairman of the Young People's Socialist League and Socialist Party, and was involved with Max Shachtman in liquidating the party and founding Social Democrats USA. The followers of Max Shachtman were not elected officials. Having anything socialist on your resume was a kiss of death at the ballot box in Cold War America. The Shachtmanites went on to be advisors, strategists, and behind the scenes, wheelers and dealers. They were both Democrats and Republicans, and despite their common membership and connections to a big-name Marxist, they were universally anti-communist. The associates of Max Shachtman went on to make up the core of people who were pumped through the ranks of academia to be functionaries of the U.S. state. They ran labor unions, foundations, and many other areas of life that were covertly nudged and guided by the intelligence apparatus. They conducted research, planned public relations campaigns, and mapped out a worldview and strategy for the elected U.S. government to follow. Who was Max Shachtman? He was born in New York City. He was a New York City labor organizer, born in Warsaw, Poland. Alan M. Wald describes him as a pleasant person, writing, "Few failed to admire his cracking wit, polemic style, sense of irony, robust humor, and exceptional political acumen. He had a Yiddish accent, dark brown eyes, jet black hair, and a penetrating gaze. He was known to wear a thin mustache." Wald references Shachtman's habit of telling long, humorous stories at parties. He quotes one which involved a roundabout reference to oral sex, contrasting it to breastfeeding. Wald also describes him as somewhat careless. Quote, "Notorious for not returning borrowed books, he could be maddeningly irresponsible, not keeping appointments or completing articles by deadlines. He tended to rush to the office and dash off an article for the party's newspaper or fulfill some other assignment at the very last minute." Shachtman was the leader of the new Workers' Party that represented Third Camp Trotskyism. His followers were mobilized to disrupt the Waldorf Peace Conference of 1949. Sidney Hook had originally formed his Committee for Cultural Freedom in 1939, right as Trotsky and the New York intellectuals were separating from each other. The idea was for an organization that would speak in the name of writers and academics, denouncing both the USSR and Nazi Germany and equating them with each other. Hannah Arendt had written about totalitarianism, and her work was popular in these circles. The Trotskyites were on the defensive at the time, arguing they had not gone over to the side of the ruling class by rejecting Trotsky's position of defending the USSR's economic foundations. As a result, they were lukewarm to the project, specifically because it did not have a leftist character and seemed to just be a condemnation and an equation of two regimes that the U.S. government also disliked, which had just become friendly. Wald quotes Socialist Appeal, condemning the organization, saying its anti-Stalinism was reactionary. The Communist Party's Daily Worker condemned those who joined Hook's project as agents of fascism, and the charge made sense. At the time, Trotsky was calling for an independent Ukraine and working to disrupt the Spanish Republic's fight against Franco. A project to undermine the Communist Party's efforts to build a united front against fascism by equating them with the Nazis was certainly the kind of psychological operation the Fifth Column would employ. The 1939 Non-Aggression Pact did not last long, and soon war broke out. This rendered any activism, especially against the Soviet Union, which realigned with the United States, pretty much illegal. Hook revived his committee in 1949 to work against the Waldorf Peace Conference. David Dubinsky, the racist New York City union boss who ran the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, cut him a check of $5,000. Trotskyites and ex-Trotskyites crawled out of the woodwork, or their various new cushy jobs within the establishment, to string together the operation. Merle Pitzel, the labor editor of Business Weekly, became a key player. The Committee for Cultural Freedom did not merely oppose the Waldorf Peace Conference. They intercepted its mail. They put out false statements to the press in the conference's name. The Committee for Cultural Freedom was not simply a group of intellectuals with a different position. It was a well-funded intelligence operation intended to prevent the Soviet Union from scoring a public relations victory. The effort to disrupt the peace conference largely failed. 3,000 people piled in to hear some of the best and brightest minds of the era oppose McCarthyism and the drive toward war. With New York City hosting the United Nations, it was very hard for the State Department to block visas, and Soviet musicians and filmmakers and writers were able to participate alongside the Americans. Francis Stone Saunders' book, Who Paid the Piper? The CIA and the Cultural Cold War, describes how the anti-communist hysteria surrounding the conference, created by the American Legion and other McCarthyists, greatly annoyed Sidney Hook. Catholic nuns were assembled to block the doors of each entrance to the hotel, loudly praying for the souls of the communists. Hook is quoted as saying, "The most dangerous thing we can do is leave the exposure of communist fronts to reactionaries." As far as Hook was concerned, fitting the opposition to the conference in with the atmosphere of red baiting and anti-communist warmongering would just solidify the participants' loyalty to the communists, reinforcing their sense of persecution. Hook's committee hoped to oppose the Waldorf Peace Conference in the language of leftists and those concerned about peace and social justice, yet would never line up with Stalin. Members of Hook's committee planned to come in and demand to speak and disrupt the conference by banging umbrellas or otherwise making a scene. They were disappointed when the conference organizers, most of whom were card-carrying communists, greeted them warmly and agreed to grant each of them 2 minutes to speak from the floor. Mary McCarthy confronted a speaker who pointed to similarities between communism and the work of Waldo Emerson. She asked if Emerson would be allowed to live in the Soviet Union with his ideology that was clearly at odds with Marxism-Leninism. The speaker shot her down, pointing out that this was the non sequitur of the year, as people with even the slightest communist connections were being denied visas to enter the United States, including those who had wanted to come to that very conference. The Trotskyites were able to embarrass Soviet novelist Alexander Fadeev and composer Dmitry Shostakovich, forcing both with pointed questions to express public approval for those who had censored their work and the work of others. Max Shachtman and his followers may have claimed they were working for cultural freedom of speech, but as intellectuals with radical roots, they had to know better. After the conference, the FBI was dispatched to Little Brown Publishing to make clear that J. Edgar Hoover strongly disapproved of Communist Party member Howard Fast's novel Spartacus, which they intended to publish. Fast had spoken at the conference and been one of the key organizers. In compliance with the FBI, Little Brown pulled the plug on Fast's book deal. Partisan Review magazine had been in print since its revival in 1937, but now it started getting a lot of funding and promotion. The Committee for Cultural Freedom soon evolved into the Congress for Cultural Freedom and began writing them hefty checks. And where did the money come from? The American taxpayers. The Congress for Cultural Freedom is considered one of the most successful programs of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. So much so that they brag about it on their website. Sidney Hook pitched it by saying, "Give me $100 million and 1,000 dedicated people, and I will guarantee to generate such a wave of democratic unrest among the masses, yes, even among the soldiers of Stalin's own empire, that all his problems for a long period of time will be internal. I can find the people." The article on the CIA website explains that the agency assembled a cadre of energetic and well-connected staffers willing to experiment with unorthodox ideas and controversial individuals if that was what it took to beat the communists at their own game. Irving Kristol was a Trotskyist among the New York intellectuals in the late 1930s, most likely a member of Shachtman's Workers' Party. At the time of his death in 2009, he was remembered as the father of neoconservatism. His New York Times obituary contains an anecdote explaining that his departure from socialism came while serving in the U.S. Armed Forces during the Second World War. The New York Times reports Mr. Kristol followed his wife to Chicago, where she had been doing graduate work and where he had what he called "my first real experience with America." Drafted into the army with a number of Midwesterners who were street toughs and anti-Semitic, he found himself shredding his youthful, radical optimism. "I can't build socialism with these people," he concluded. "They'll probably take it over or make a racket out of it." The New York Times obituary continues. In his opinion, his fellow GIs were inclined to loot, rape, murder, and only army discipline held them in check. It was this perception about human nature that would stay with him for the rest of his life, creating a tension with his alternative view that ordinary people were to be trusted more than intellectuals to do the right thing. This former socialist and associate of the Shachtmanites, who disliked his fellow combatants, somehow got selected to lead the Congress for Cultural Freedom. He oversaw the program through which the CIA set up Paris Review, Der Monat, and Encounter, leftist magazines that promoted anti-communism and launched demonization campaigns against Soviet intellectuals who stood with the Soviet Union. Albert Einstein and Lillian Hellman were among their targets. The Congress for Cultural Freedom also went out of its way to select and popularize certain writers and voices who could serve the purpose of giving a leftist and edgy face to opposing the Soviet Union. The CIA highlighted James Baldwin, a writer who could eloquently condemn racism while opposing the primary anti-racist organizations in the United States, such as the Civil Rights Congress and other groups led by communists. The CIA helped arrange the publication of Ralph Ellison's anti-racist novel, Invisible Man, which demonized the Communist Party as opportunistically using black issues for its own gain. The CIA also helped arrange the publication of a book called The God That Failed, compiling the testimonies of angry ex-communists like Arthur Kessler and Richard Wright. But the Congress for Cultural Freedom went beyond simply giving a leftist cover to anti-communism. The Committee for Cultural Freedom discovered and popularized the work of Jackson Pollock, a once communist-adjacent painter who made abstract art by splattering paint on a canvas. The Congress for Cultural Freedom publications hailed Pollock's work as an expression of freedom and compared it to socialist realism, which they denounced as totalitarian propaganda with its realistic images and messages about truth and morality. Experimental music also got a boost from the CIA, since its scrambled, confusing tones were considered much healthier than the triumphant emotional tones of modernist and classical music, which inspired people and created optimism. The CIA's effort to influence art and culture during the Cold War, with loads of Trotskyites on the payroll, were very far-reaching. It wasn't about promoting anti-Stalinist Marxism. It wasn't even simply about promoting anti-communism. It was about promoting a kind of aesthetic and mindset. Hannah Arendt's work on anti-totalitarianism had been loved by the New York intellectuals. The CIA apparently liked her a lot as well, because the publications it covertly funded featured her work very prominently. When Adolf Eichmann was extradited to Israel and tried for crimes during the Holocaust, Arendt composed a book on the trial called Eichmann in Jerusalem, a study in the banality of evil. The book described how Eichmann was a normal person without any special qualities that had propelled him to become a Nazi war criminal. Before, during, and after the Second World War, Marxists with both pro-Soviet and Trotskyite-aligned views had composed volumes explaining that fascism and war were rooted in the breakdown of the capitalist system. British communist theoretician R. Palm Dutt had composed Fascism and Social Revolution, describing the built-in problem of overproduction, value crisis, and the tendency of the falling rate of profit, and how this propelled the Western imperialist nations to collapse into illiberal authoritarianism. Eventually, Lynn Marcus, born Lyndon LaRouche, composed a text called Dialectical Economics, showing this in even more depth. But according to Arendt, fascism and totalitarianism were rooted in the human spirit. People were just cruel, mean-spirited, and conforming. Mass movements like Nazism and Stalinism, as well as Christianity, presented an opportunity for our natural evil to come out. And according to Arendt, our natural target would always be the Jews. Her work on totalitarianism lists anti-Semitism, i.e., hatred of one specific ethnic group, as an essential part of the formula for creating a totalitarian regime. Hannah Arendt was also a harsh critic of Zionism. She composed a book highlighting Zionist collaboration with the Nazis. She was widely condemned for her relationship with far-right philosopher Martin Heidegger, who had ties to the Nazis and had engineered much of their vision for a conservative revolution. After the Second World War, fascism was pretty universally hated. The crimes of the Holocaust were well documented. German and Japanese society were in a state of mass repentance and acknowledgement of war guilt. The anti-fascist credentials of the communists were solid. Communists had led the partisan brigades that killed Mussolini. They had led the underground resistance in France and had organized the Korean workers in Japan to sabotage war industries and save Chinese and American lives on the battlefield. The communists had battled Oswald Mosley on the streets of London and Franco in the fields of Spain years before the Allied nations had solidified their anti-Nazi position. Communists condemned McCarthyism and racism for their ideological overlap with the Nazis. During the Second World War, the Communist Party had worked hard to highlight the oppression of Black people and link it to Nazi ideology in the public mind. Many non-communist Jewish Americans were sickened by McCarthyism because it reminded them of Nazi rhetoric. Until the Second World War, over-the-top hatred for the Reds almost always linked them to an ethnic group that was significantly overrepresented in the Marxist movement. Marx's own writings speaking harshly against Jewish people and their call for religious freedom, and Lenin's vehement condemnation of both Zionism and the Jewish Socialist Bund did not factor in. It is in the writing on fascism from the Congress for Cultural Freedom aligned CIA-promoted writers, most with Trotskyite roots, that we find their true feelings. The best way to target communism to their liberal-minded readers was to go after fascism and equate it with communism. This comes most blatantly in the work of Susan Sontag, who got her boost from Partisan Review. Her piece for the New York Times Review of Books entitled Fascinating Fascism broadens the definition of fascism to include any and all mass movements. She described the fascist aesthetic, explaining her view, "It is generally thought that National Socialism stands only for the brutish and terror. But this is not true. National Socialism, more broadly fascism, stands for an ideal, or rather ideals that are persistent today under other banners. The ideal of life as art, the cult of beauty, fetishism of courage, the dissolution of alienation and the ecstatic feelings of community, the family of man. Although the Nuba are Black, not Aryan, Riefenstahl's portrait of them evokes the same larger themes of Nazi ideology: the contact between the clean and the impure, the incorruptible and the defiled, the physical and the mental, and the joyful and the critical." She goes on to describe what she considers to be fascist: extravagant effort and endurance of pain, mass groupings of people, the turning of people into things, the multiplication and replication of things, and the grouping of people and things around an all-powerful hypnotic leader, figure, or force. The fascist dramaturgy centers on the orgiastic transaction between mighty forces and their puppets, uniformly garbed and shown in swelling numbers. Its choreography alternates between ceaseless motions and congealed static virile posing. Fascist art glorifies surrender, it exalts mindlessness, it glamorizes death. Mass athletic demonstration, a choreographed display of bodies, are a valued activity in all totalitarian countries. The art of the gymnast, so popular now in Eastern Europe, also evokes recurrent features of fascist aesthetics: the holding in or confining of force, military precision. Sontag later went on to explain her true feelings in the early 1980s at a rally supporting the CIA-backed Solidarność labor unrest in Poland. Speaking to a crowd of anti-communist leftists who booed her, she said, "Communism is fascism. Successful fascism, if you will. Communism is in itself a variant, the most successful variant of fascism." The Solidarność protests she was supporting were clearly being funded and directed by the Solidarity Center, a project of the United Auto Workers and the AFL-CIO to subsidize and promote anti-communist labor activism around the world. The AFL-CIO director at the time was George Meany. Max Shachtman was his personal assistant. The New Left had nothing to do with proletarians rising up against the bourgeoisie in the Marxist sense. Aside from the rhetoric of Black nationalists and radicals, it had very little to do with oppressed and colonized nations resisting the imperialist economic order in the Leninist sense. But it carried over a thread from Trotsky and his theory of permanent revolution. Fidel Castro wrote about the New Left in a column for Grandma newspaper after he retired. He wrote, quote, "Both in the United States and in Europe, the big outdoor rock concerts were used to stop the increasing discontent among the population. According to recently released CIA documents, thanks to the Freedom of Information Act, Allen Dulles purchased over 100 million doses of LSD, almost all of which flooded the streets of the United States during the late 60s. Thousands of graduate students served as guinea pigs. Soon they were synthesizing their own acid. The overwhelming majority of anti-war protesters went into Students for a Democratic Society on the basis of outrage at the development of the Vietnam War. but once caught in the environment defined by the Tavistock Institute's psychological warfare experiments. Project MK Ultra is largely responsible for the popularization of drug culture in the United States during the 1960s. While conservatives consider the hippie counterculture to be communist, communist governments did not. An article in the leftist publication Monthly Review called How to Visit a Socialist Country warns American activists who may visit Cuba, Vietnam, China, or North Korea that it will not match their aesthetic tastes. Marxist-Leninist governments tend to promote classical music, traditional two-parent families. Patriotism and militarism is a big and visible part of daily life. Trotsky condemned the Soviet Union as it solidified really existing socialism. His book, The Revolution Betrayed, speaks about thermidor in the family and decried the pending ban on abortion. Marxism carried with it a spirit of rebellion and opposition to the established order and traditional morality. Trotsky held on to this and hated seeing the revolution he engineered back away from it. As the New York intellectuals got funded by American intelligence, they struggled to hold on to this subversive self-identity. While they did not want to associate with Stalin and his authoritarian regime and were happy to align with U.S. imperialism against it, they needed to feel that they were rebels and at odds with the status quo. The New York intellectuals all moved roughly in the same direction, more and more solidly into the U.S. camp during the Cold War and to the right wing of U.S. foreign policy. But as they made this march, they persecuted each other. The young Irving Howe is described by Alan M. Wald as an immediate and admiring supporter of Max Shachtman. He had organized the strike against imperialist war at City College in New York, encouraging his students to walk out in protest of draft registration and hear speeches from Sidney Hook and James Burnham that condemned both U.S. military escalation and Stalinist social patriotism in the name of anti-fascism. After Shachtman split with the SWP, he appointed Irving Howe to be the editor of the magazine Labor Action. Howe's work appeared in Partisan Review and Commentary. Howe started getting under Shachtman's skin as he refused to stick to the third camp script. Shachtman and the bulk of his followers were on the CIA payroll at this point, but publicly Shachtman's position was neither Washington or Moscow. But Irving Howe started writing publicly what the Shachtmanites were already thinking, at least subconsciously. In 1948, he wrote that the situation in Eastern Europe was worse than it had been 10 years prior during the rise of Hitler because now Stalinism had overtaken Czechoslovakia and Hungary. He called for honest pessimism. Finally, in 1952, after fighting with Max Shachtman about the nature of his Labor Action publication and his frequent straying from the plague on both your houses party line that accompanied an organization of CIA collaborators, Irving Howe resigned from the Independent Socialist League. His resignation, co-signed by his two close associates, Stanley Plastrick and Emanuel Geltman, proclaimed, "The third camp concepts now seem meaningless to us. As democratic socialists, our place is in the West, no matter how sharp our criticism of its bourgeois leadership." Shachtman's condemnation of Irving Howe was harsh. He accused him of political instability and referred to his collaborator, Stanley Plastrick, as a political chameleon. Shachtman declared that Howe had abandoned the cause and that openly supporting Western imperialist countries ceases to be, in the sense of the word, really socialist. Shachtman eventually liquidated the Independent Socialist League and joined the Socialist Party of America in the early 1960s. The SP refused to allow his followers the dignity of joining as a group and forced each one to apply individually as a kind of ritual humiliation, revenge on a rival tendency that was admitting defeat. Shachtman repudiated Leninism entirely, agreeing with the position he had long argued against, that it was inherently totalitarian and undemocratic. The Independent Socialist Club of UC Berkeley re-affiliated and broke with Shachtman, instead endorsing British Trotskyist leader Tony Cliff. the International Socialist Organization, eventually emerged out of the remnants of the Shachtmanites who refused to give up on Leninism, becoming the primary campus leftist group in the 1980s and 90s. The ISO was funded by a nonprofit called Haymarket Books, which still exists. The primary financial backer of Haymarket Books was the Wallace Global Fund for Social Justice, paid for by the estate of Vice President Henry Wallace. The ISO dissolved in 2019 after a number of internal sexual scandals. It still operates as a faction of Democratic Socialists of America. Irving Howe's break with Shachtman was hardly the end of his political career. Howe flourished as an academic and held on to his socialist credentials. Howe wrote for Dissent magazine and condemned pacifist A.J. Muste for attending a peace rally and speaking alongside communist leaders. To be seen with the Stalinists in 1957 was an unforgivable crime. Wald notes that at the same time, Howe was openly endorsing the Democratic Party and had no qualms campaigning for and working to support the party Wald notes that at the same time, Howe was openly endorsing the Democratic Party and had no qualms campaigning for and working to support the party overseeing lynching and Jim Crow segregation throughout the South. As the 1960s anti-Vietnam War movement escalated, Irving Howe was featured in the New York Times Magazine with two pieces condemning them from a Marxist perspective, quoting Lenin and highlighting the most extreme rhetoric and activities of China-inspired radicals in Students for a Democratic Society. In 1971, he penned an op-ed for the New York Times claiming that while it was valid to criticize Israel, the anti-Zionist rhetoric of many anti-Vietnam War activists was rooted in anti-Semitism. A widely told anecdote among Howe's friends described how he was confronted by a fiery young Maoist who objected to his work. He rebuked the student, saying, "You know what you're going to be, kid? A dentist." In 1972, the Socialist Party of America ceased to exist. The party that had run Eugene Debs for office and gotten nearly 1 million votes in 1912, and then became a bastion for leftist anti-communism under Norman Thomas and the home of many AFL union bosses, finally kicked the bucket because its members couldn't agree about the Vietnam War. All the Leninists had been banned from the organization for a long time. No one in the ranks of the SP had supported the Vietnamese or seen them as heroically battling U.S. imperialism. A minority opposed the Vietnam War for pacifist and religious reasons. They were led by David McReynolds, the founder of the War Resisters League. They established the Socialist Party USA, and McReynolds became the first openly gay man to run for president on its ticket. The SPUSA remains intact today primarily as an electoral entity that participates in the presidential race every 4 years. Michael Harrington, Irving Howe, and a number of others who had initially supported the Vietnam War had backed into a position calling for de-escalation and negotiations. They formed the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee. They were joined by Gloria Steinem, the celebrity voice of American feminism, who owed her entire career to the CIA, as far back as 1962, when she worked with Professor Zbigniew Brzezinski and a young Barney Frank to disrupt the World Youth Festival in Vienna as a CIA project. The DSA continues to exist up to today, getting rebooted a few times. In the 1980s, DSA served as a deprogramming operation, bringing ex-Maoists into the Democratic Party as China's politics shifted. In the 1990s, DSA served as a vehicle for corralling labor activists, with George Sweeney leading the AFL-CIO and labor on the defensive as a result of NAFTA. Cornel West, the black theologian who composed Race Matters, became the most well-known voice of the organization. DSA was in obscurity during the Iraq War days, but rebooted again during Occupy Wall Street as the Bernie Sanders presidential campaigns. It is now an association of people who ring doorbells and register voters for the squad of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Rashida Tlaib. Max Shachtman was a Richard Nixon supporter at the time of his death in 1972. His followers did not join the Socialist Party or the Democratic Socialists of America. They instead formed a small discussion club called Social Democrats USA. Despite having persecuted Irving Howe for saying it, Shachtman eventually adopted his position of being on the Western side of the Cold War. He came to the conclusion in the early 1960s. According to Alan Wald, his logic for doing so was based on adopting Rosa Luxemburg's concept of socialism or barbarism. Rosa Luxemburg had argued in 1914 that imperialism would lead the Western world either to have a socialist revolution or decline into depopulation, desolation, a great cemetery. She compared the possible future of the West to Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire. The choice was either to advance to socialism or decline into barbarism. Shachtman declared the Soviet Union and Stalinism was barbarism, and he supported Western imperialism as superior to it. His logic is hard to comprehend. The Soviet Union and its allies emerged from the East. Their system was a result of nations of the Eastern and colonized world breaking free from Western imperialism and seizing control of their economies to develop. These governments did not emerge from within the Western imperialist centers, and their effect was not to bring a great cemetery. The Communist Party of China, the Communist Party of Vietnam, etc., have not depopulated by any means, but have increased living standards, stability, and the population significantly. But basing himself on his new position that Stalinism was barbarism, Max Shachtman supported the Bay of Pigs invasion and the Vietnam War. In 1972, he had been a Democrat, but he supported Hubert Humphrey and Henry Jackson in the primary, following the lead of his boss, George Meany, director of the AFL-CIO. George McGovern won the Democratic primary in 1972, largely because the party was embarrassed by the 1968 chaos, trying to revamp itself amid Nixon's rise to power and the confusion and cultural upheaval. New rules had been written and new messages had been floated. George McGovern won the nomination in 1972 and promised to immediately end the war in Vietnam, while Nixon maintained an honorable end was needed. Max Shachtman viewed George McGovern as too sympathetic to the barbarism of Marxist-Leninist governments that he opposed. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a Cold War strategist and lifelong Democrat, who went on to serve as Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, took the same position. As a result, both of them voted for Richard Nixon, seeing the anti-war Democrat who had won the primary as too far left and just not anti-Stalinist enough for their tastes. Irving Kristol, who directed the Congress for Cultural Freedom when it collaborated with the Shachtmanites, was also a Nixon supporter in 1972, and he had supported him in 1968 as well. His thinking echoed that of Irving Howe and Max Shachtman around the same time. While they had essentially created the New Left with the CIA and with CIA support and direction, they did not like where it had taken things by 1968 and 69. Students for a Democratic Society, led by two Maoist factions, the Weathermen and the Progressive Labor Party, were regularly waving the flags of the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. The civil rights movement had transitioned into adopting the slogan Black Power, and with more radical voices from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee taking the lead by the mid-1960s. By 1968, the Black Panther Party was riding high, distributing Mao's Little Red Book and running free breakfast programs while carrying guns. To top it all off, these pro-Stalinist radicals on the campuses and in the Black community had supported the Palestinians and condemned Israel. Richard Nixon was perhaps the lesser of two evils. He could beat back the threat of a pro-communist student activist movement and Black radicalism. Irving Kristol is usually credited alongside Leo Strauss as being the founder of neoconservatism. Leo Strauss was a philosophy professor who fled Nazi Germany and taught in New York City and Chicago. Susan Sontag was his student. Irving Kristol considered him a close friend. Strauss's major work was Philosophy and the Art of Writing, Persecution and the Art of Writing. He argued that the great philosophers of history had written in a coded way to avoid persecution by the inferior rabble. Kristol described Strauss in glowing terms. Encountering Strauss produced the kind of intellectual shock that is a once-in-a-lifetime experience. He turned one's intellectual universe upside down. What made him so controversial within academia was his disbelief in the Enlightenment doctrine of the truth will make man free. His disbelief in the Enlightenment doctrine of the truth will make man free. He was an intellectual aristocrat who thought the truth could make some minds free, but was convinced there was an inherent conflict between philosophic truth and political order. He was contemptuous of the modern demagogic idolatry of the common man. Strauss was a defender of the noble lie. Common people needed to be manipulated and deceived for the world to function properly. The Nation summarized his worldview, writing, "Intellectuals, he believed, would have to spread an ideology of good and evil, whether they believed it or not." So the American people could be mobilized against enemies of freedom. For this reason, Strauss, we learn in one of the many telling asides, was a huge fan of the TV show Gunsmoke and its Manichaean depiction of good and evil. Manichaean depiction of good and evil. The influence of Strauss and Crystal in the back room of the Republican Party shouldn't be understated. Strauss's love for Gunsmoke seems to be hardly a coincidence in relation to the fact that two U.S. presidents, Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush, both cultivated a cowboy persona. Reagan had literally been a cowboy actor from Hollywood. Bush had been born to old money in Connecticut. But for his campaign, he played up his ranch, his guns, and was filmed cutting brush as he wore a cowboy hat. He used phrases like "smoke 'em out" when describing efforts to capture Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. During the Bush years, talk of the neocons became common. Lyndon LaRouche, ahead of the game, but speaking from the margins of American politics, and somewhat incoherently highlighted the role of Leo Strauss. He published a book, Children of Satan, that somewhat incoherently, in the voices of many authors, described a continuity from the Congress for Cultural Freedom to the 1960s drug culture, to the evangelical Christian right wing, and to the post-9/11 war on terror of George W. Bush. Knowledge of different factions within the American deep state seems to have trickled in from European intelligence circles. George W. Bush's Axis of Evil speech was a pivotal moment, speaking in the direct aftermath of 9/11. "Some of these regimes have been pretty quiet since 9/11, but we know their true nature. North Korea is a regime arming missiles, weapons of mass destruction, while starving citizens. Iran aggressively purposes these weapons and exports terror, while an unelected few repress the Iranian people and their freedom. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility to America and support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and gas and nuclear weapons and has already used poison gas to murder thousands of its citizens, leaving bodies of mothers huddled over their dead children. This is a regime that has agreed to kick out international inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten world peace. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave danger to the world. This could provide the arms of the terrorists, giving them means to match their hatred. They could attack our allies or attempt to blackmail the United States. In any case, the price of indifference would be catastrophic. We will work closely with our allies to deny the terrorists and their state sponsors the materials, technology, and expertise to make and deliver weapons of mass destruction. We will develop and deploy effective missile defense to protect America and our allies from sudden attack. And all nations should know America will do what is necessary to ensure our national security. We'll be deliberate, and yet time is not on our side. I will not wait for events to gather the dangers. I will not stand by as perils closer and closer. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons." Bush's axis of evil rhetoric was condemned by Zbigniew Brzezinski, according to his biography written by Justin Vossi. He did not agree with formulating U.S. opposition to three particular governments in a moralistic way. Brzezinski's trademark had been using proxies, manipulating China against Vietnam and the Soviet Union, arming jihadists against the Soviet Union, and his Afghan trap. Such moralistic framing of good versus evil was not strategic at all. As talk of the neocons became mainstream and almost an obsession of the New York Times, it was defined as a group of intellectuals who believed the United States was on a moralistic crusade to spread freedom across the planet. The label has been given to people like John Bolton, Elliott Abrams, Mike Pompeo, Marco Rubio, Nikki Haley, and many others. It is associated with the belief that the USA must actively spread democracy by overthrowing governments. Many point to the Project for a New American Century, put together by Irving Kristol's son, Bill Kristol, and signed by many alumni of the Reagan administration and future Bush appointees as a definitive expression of the neocon worldview. While the American public has largely repudiated this worldview, it remains the way the bulk of those who rise up through the Ivy League schools to work in the State Department view world affairs. The neocon perspective proliferated among those studying Sovietology in the 1980s. The pedagogy teaches that Marxism-Leninism is the prototype, but Nazi Germany is the most widely varied form of political evil. It is the tendency of nations to create illiberal governments that do not protect intellectuals and oppose the open international system. The history of the 20th century is presented as a battle between the Western ideals of individual freedom and totalitarianism. The United States is chosen for the noble mission of marching freedom across the globe in a crusade. Each authoritarian regime is another Hitler. Each regime change war is a reenactment of the Second World War. And those who oppose it are naive appeasers or fifth columnists. However, one can hear echoes of thinking in the work of Anne Marie Slaughter, Hillary Clinton's strategist, who composed a piece for Foreign Affairs published after Trump was elected entitled The Power of Populism. Slaughter channels Trotsky and his call for global revolution much more clearly. In her piece, the mission of the United States is to use technology and the internet to foment unrest and topple governments that get in the way of the open international system. The enemy, as she sees it, is populism. She lists Xi Jinping of China, Putin of Russia, Maduro of Venezuela, and the Islamic Republic of Iran, and other various states Washington dislikes as key examples of populism. Yes, though some struggle to identify it, there is definitely a continuity from Anne Marie Slaughter and John Bolton back to a Ukrainian-born agitator who called for permanent revolution and condemned the conservative bureaucracy of an Asiatic, baiting him for being educated in a seminary school and born in Georgia. Since the rise of right-wing intellectual and social media personality Jordan Peterson, the phrase postmodern neo-Marxist has become almost cliche. It has been correctly pointed out, even by some of the most obnoxious liberal voices, such as Natalie ContraPoints-Wynn, that the term is oxymoronic. Marxism is an ideology that attempts to explain the nature of reality and present a grand narrative for human history. Postmodernism is the belief that such narratives do not exist, and that attempts to build them are totalitarian in nature. And the only ethical role of intellectuals is one of deconstruction, i.e., dissecting and debunking such narratives in order to lay the basis for freedom of mind. Postmodernism isn't Marxism by definition, but postmodernists are happy to use Marxian analysis in the process of deconstruction. Postmodernists debunk the narrative that capitalism is human nature, showing that human society has contained many different economic modes of existence. Postmodernists debunk conservative worship of the traditional family by drawing from Engels' work, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, showing that the family unit emerged as the result of changes in social relations. Postmodernism isn't Marxism and is, in reality, a more flattering and polite term for what George Lukács called philosophical irrationalism. Lukács' widely circulated book, The Destruction of Reason, focuses on the work of Friedrich Nietzsche, showing its roots and arguing that it laid the intellectual basis for Nazi crimes and is really the intellectual incarnation of capitalism in the imperialist stage of monopolistic capitalism, parasitic or decaying capitalism, moribund capitalism, imperialism. The Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin, who has embraced postmodernism to some degree, arguing it allows Russia to have its own separate way of being and reality contrary to the West, has pointed to the problems of Western civilization as being values of liberalism taken to their extreme conclusion. Quote, all forms of collective identity, ethnic, national, religious, caste, and so on, impede an individual's awareness of his individuality. Liberalism encourages the individual to become himself, that is, free of all those social identities and dependencies that constrain and define the individual from outside. The victory of liberalism resolved this question. The individual became the normative subject within the framework of all mankind. This is the phenomenon of globalization. Entered the stage, the model of post-industrial society makes itself known. The postmodern era begins. It is in this understanding that we find the thread of continuity from Leon Trotsky to Leo Strauss, from the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia to the Bush administration and the Lincoln Project of anti-Trump Republicans. In all these narratives, the people are the enemy. Trotsky was an advocate of revolution in his homeland, but he loathed the Russian peasantry. The notion that a backward country dweller could have a role in a revolutionary government, or that demands for land redistribution should be included in the movement, repulsed him. Likewise, the idea of separating from the respectable circles of Western Marxism and joining a party of new type of professional revolutionaries going lower and deeper to the real masses, rather than fighting for a seat at the table of social democracy, also repulsed him. He explained shortly before his death that he was defeated because of flaws in the people. Quote, I was defeated because the working class, as a result of internal and external conditions, showed itself too weak to liquidate its own bureaucracy. It was not his own failure to mobilize the workers around a correct line. It was not any possible flaw in his political positions or leadership. The people were flawed. The peasantry was inherently backward. Their chosen leader, Stalin, was a representation of their barbarian nature, their Asiatic bruteness. The Shachtmanites took liberalism a bit further. They firstly wanted no association with the Soviet Union. It was a totalitarian state that suppressed the freedom of intellectuals. Furthermore, they did not want to succumb to the discipline of a revolutionary organization. They had no use for party patriotism. They thought for themselves, and they did not take orders from Moscow or Mexico City. And that is why they embraced the sudden anti-Soviet shift of U.S. society and dumped Trotsky's mild loyalties to the Soviet Union's economic foundations. From there, the New Left and Nazi Germany, from there, the New Left notion that Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were equivalent emerges. The problem with both regimes is their collectivist nature, the dramaturgy of leader and chorus, celebration of strength, feelings of community. As far as Susan Sontag was concerned, this was all dangerous fascism mixed with sadomasochism. Hannah Arendt echoed her concerns, seeing Adolf Eichmann as an ordinary man and Nazi Germany as the result of excessive democratic participation by human beings who were inherently cruel and heartless deep down. From there, the notion that the United States is on a noble mission to spread freedom and make sure that no such society ever arises makes perfect sense. The idea that it is absolutely necessary to lie to those who would obstruct such a noble mission fits as well. While we may not see the benefit of having our relatives come home in body bags or our roads and bridges crumble as we mobilize to topple some authoritarian or illiberal regime, lies about chemical weapons attacks or Russian hackers or weapons of mass destruction or whatever else are necessary to win our support for their crusade. Neoconservatism, like Trotskyism and Marxism, is not a Jewish conspiracy or a conspiracy of any kind. Conspiracies involve a group of people coming together to consciously plan and commit a crime. The neoconservatives have certainly been involved in many conspiracies, but their beliefs are not a conspiracy in and of themselves. Their beliefs represent genuine feelings, reinforced by a slew of academic works, books, films, distorted presentations of world history, etc. The story told over and over again in Western media, in dystopian novels, in understanding of the 20th century history pumped out by Western academia, and in so many other places, is of humanity as a horrific, cruel, heartless mob. We are told communist revolutions led to nothing but gulags and starvation. We are told that the crimes of Nazism were not rooted in the breakdown of German imperialism or economic crisis, but some psychological reality of Germans or perhaps all human beings. In this narrative dished out to us from Western media over and over, there are a few smart, kind people who stand in front of the tanks in Tiananmen Square. They should be exalted and allowed to rise to the top because barbarism is our natural tendency, and we would happily run them over and crush their skulls under the road wheels. This narrative fits the experience of Jewish people, no doubt, as people that were set aside in European society to serve as the purpose of moneylenders, a people that were victims of persecution and demonization, and gradually crafted a religious worldview that explained this horrendous experience. Lenin condemned these feelings, calling them the spirit of the ghetto. When contending with the Jewish Bund, he wrote, "The idea of a Jewish nationality is definitely reactionary, not only when expounded by its consistent advocates, the Zionists, but likewise on the lips of those who combine it with the ideas of social democracy, the Bundists. The idea of a Jewish nationality runs counter to the interests of the Jewish proletariat, for it fosters among them, directly or indirectly, a spirit hostile to assimilation, the spirit of the ghetto. Hostility towards non-native sections of the population can only be eliminated when the non-native section of the population ceases to be alien and blends with the general mass of the population. That is the only possible solution of the Jewish problem, and we should support everything that makes the ending of Jewish isolation. Yet the Bund is resisting this only possible solution, for it is helping not to end, but to increase and legitimize Jewish isolation by propagating the idea of a Jewish nation and a plan for federating Jews and non-Jewish proletarians. The idea that Jews are so special and so different they cannot assimilate into European civilization and will always face persecution from the barbarian, hateful Christians is the basis for Zionism. But the mindset behind it did not originate with Zionists, as Friedrich Nietzsche held the same view while also being anti-Semitic. Anti-humanism and pessimism are the intellectual basis for neoconservatism. Trotsky had a big dose of it, as did his heirs who found their way into the power structure of the declining West. Many neocons are not Jews, and many non-conservatives share this perspective. Philosophical irrationalism has become the unstated party line in Western countries. It bleeds through television, media, the dystopian schemes of the World Economic Forum, and everywhere else. But the reality is that the revolutions of the 20th century were not barbarism, as Max Shachtman retreated into proclaiming. They turned Russia and China into superpowers. They unleashed a level of collective heroism and brilliance that invented space travel in the 1950s and today lights up corners of Africa and Central Asia with electricity. The Belt and Road, the Kerch Bridge, the Three Gorges Dam, the progress toward fusion energy, and so many other mighty achievements of development show that humanity outside the Western imperialist system is taking leaps toward eradicating poverty and creating a good life for all. The neocons just give voice to the pessimism of those who fund their work and highlight their message, those who sit atop the declining Western financial order rooted in colonialism and screaming for Malthusianism as the only hope for stopping their eventual displacement. The world is becoming multipolar, and humanity is marching toward greater abundance, peace, and prosperity than ever before. The neocons and their wars may hold this off for a bit, but they cannot stop it. Their pessimism is their own. The future of humanity is bright. And then I end it with a personal note called From a Manhattan Diner. Around 2012, I was a young member of the Workers' World Party in New York City. My party was rooted in Trotskyism, founded by Sam Marcy, a member of the New York City SWP in the 1930s, who had been disgusted by the New York intellectuals and eventually fled the city of Buffalo to form his own wing of Trotskyism. He eventually established Workers' World Party in 1959, and his organization went into considerable lengths to distance itself from Trotskyism, realizing it was pretty much synonymous with anti-communism. In 2012, I was still mourning the death of Gaddafi. I was disgusted with how the leftists had championed the CIA-backed revolution that destroyed the most prosperous country on the African continent. I was disgusted with my own organization that had nominally supported Gaddafi, but constantly distanced itself from him and limited its opposition to the bombing in a desire to pander and fit in with liberal activists who took their cues from Obama. I had studied Gaddafi's Green Book and adopted a minority position that Libya was, in fact, a deformed workers' state and not a bourgeois nationalist regime, as my party had maintained. This position had made me the target of Fred Goldstein, the party's ideological leader, who could not defend his position that China and Cuba were workers' states, but Libya was a bourgeois nationalist regime. Fred had decided I was trouble and proceeded to marginalize me within the group. The one time I tried to talk to him about my position, rooted in studying economics, the economics of Libya, and Trotsky's work, and the 1939 split in the SWP, Fred had just blown up into a rage and started shaking his fists at me. "Who told you you could just go read Trotsky on your own?" he'd asked. "If you keep this up, I swear. He snarled at me in his exaggerated New York street tough accent. Though I was in denial about it at the time, I was not long for Workers' World Party. It would take them a couple years to drive me out. I had made myself useful to Fred's rivals in the leadership by doing the work and building protests when most of the members were in semi-retirement. I brought in new contacts to the office, I distributed the newspaper, and did the outreach most of the membership refused to do. This kept them from pushing me out as quickly as Fred would have liked. The nail in my coffin was when my journalism career took off, when I was getting flown to Caracas, to Tehran, or to Moscow to give speeches about anti-imperialism. Even those in WWP's leadership who had liked me could only see the jealousy. I had youthful energy, enthusiasm, and fresh analysis their elderly state of burnout and pessimism could not match. Their outdated analysis did not fit the world in our time when Soviet-style governments are pretty much gone and was increasingly difficult to mouth or match with reality. Regardless, in 2012, I was sitting in a Manhattan restaurant with a young Arab American woman, a young woman of Arab American heritage. She had been around the party as a teen, but had drifted away. My job, sitting across from her in the Manhattan diner, was to win her back to the party. As we talked, trading stories and jokes about activist circles that we both inhabited, we couldn't help but notice an elderly man with a cane staring at us and soaking in every word. He finally walked over to the table and said, almost in a whisper, as if he was discussing a crime or a deeply personal matter, "Are you guys communists?" We replied that we were. I proceeded to give him a copy of Workers' World newspaper. He took the paper from me and stared at us, and then in a hushed voice said, "My father was a Trotskyist." The young woman and I looked at each other, confused. The old man proceeded to tell us a story that has stuck with me year after year. He told of how he'd grown up in Manhattan to modestly wealthy parents of Jewish heritage. His father had written for conservative magazines and voted Republican. He said that as a teenager, he had gone to anti-Vietnam War protests with some friends, and he'd bought a copy of a communist newspaper. He brought it home with him, and when his father found the newspaper, he had gulped nervously, expecting his father would unleash an angry tirade as a staunch conservative. Instead, his father had burst into tears. He'd begun to tell the old man who was standing in front of us that day in 2012, then a young man who had just been at an anti-war rally, about how he sold a newspaper that looked like this one as a teenager at City College. He had walked the streets of Manhattan and Brooklyn, spreading the gospel of workers' revolution and the commonwealth of toil that is to be when a rationally planned economy produces wealth and comfort for all, and the exploitation of man by man is abolished. In his tears, the man's father had said that while he was naive in his youth, those had been the best years of his life. When he stood for something, believed in something, and despite the poverty and the looming war, had hope for the future. And the story has always stuck with me. While Marxism-Leninism is aesthetic and rejects all, while Marxism-Leninism is atheistic and rejects all but the material world, all that is good that has come out of it has relied on spiritual energy. The thrill and joy of being comrades, working to achieve political objectives and carry out operations, the collective optimism people are able to unleash in such circumstances is amazingly powerful. It is this that the neocons are trying to destroy. It is the passion that says human beings are not merely animals, that right and wrong do exist, and that with our collective brilliance and shared commitment, the hardships of our current world can be indeed overcome. But to hold on to this power, this spiritual energy, requires commitment. It requires party patriotism. It requires being willing to subordinate your individual aspirations. It requires viewing the organization as sacred and worth preserving above all frustrations and disappointments. And that is my book, Trotsky and the Neoconservatives.